Okay, we're here with a rent control board candidate, Brad Ewing. Brad, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for running. And do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to run?
Yeah, so my name is Brad Ewing. I've been living here in Santa Monica for a little bit over 10 years now. Been a rent control tenant that entire time. I felt really compelled to run. So my building turned over in ownership in the last year. The new landlord has not been great. They tried to push out an elderly neighbor of mine using a banked maximum allowable rent increase. My wife and I have been dealing with habitability issues. My neighbors have also been dealing with things that are borderline habitability issues with the building's plumbing. It got me to explore the rent decrease petition process. Fortunately, I did not have to file that because preparing all of that seems like that was enough to kick the landlord into gear and actually fix the problem. So that was really nice. But it really got me keyed in to these kinds of issues. And so I've been volunteering with the Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights tenant hotline for I want to say about 6 months now. And so that's been very fulfilling and educational as well. Um, and yeah, I'm running because I want to protect my neighbors. I want to protect Santa Monica renters. And I think this is a great place to do that.
Great, thanks, Brad. So I wanted to ask you about your time on the SMER tenant hotline. What did you learn through that process that you didn't know about Santa Monica or rent control going in?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I learned is there's even actually like federal rights that you have, particularly under things like satellite dishes. So that one was quite new to me. But I think what I learned is like there's definitely gaps in how we do enforcement and getting tenants help. I think the biggest recurring issue that I see on the hotline is frustration with code enforcement, where people, because that's usually one of the first things I recommend when it seems like it's a code enforcement issue. Often people have reached out, but they weren't able to get a resolution. Either code enforcement didn't come back to them, or code enforcement seemed to kick the ball around. So I think that is foremost like a pretty big issue. Secondarily, I do get a fair amount of like non-rent controlled Santa Monica tenants calling in. Those can be more difficult to handle. In those situations, I handle them on a case by case basis. So, one gentleman, for example, was a veteran, and while he wasn't able to get access to rent control rights that he would have, turns out, well, he has other avenues through the VA, right? So I was able to get him connected through those resources.
Cool, thank you. Okay, yeah, let's go to Kay.
Hey Brad.
Hey, Kate.
I wanted to turn to the section about SB 79. You say that you supported SB 79 from the start when it was still an intent bill. Can you talk about that, why you supported it um, and how you see that aligning with your intent to run as a rent control board commissioner?
Yeah, no, great question. Let's get right into the tension. So, look, I supported SB 79 because I think we're in the midst of a housing shortage, and this housing shortage isn't new. It's been growing over the decades. And I believe that a shortage and a scarcity of housing hands landlords immense leverage and power over renters. When market rents are climbing faster than inflation, and when they climb far above what long-term rent control tenants are paying, that creates every financial incentive for the landlord to try to push those tenants out so they can collect a higher rent. And so, for example, the city of Berkeley, a peer city in many regards in terms of strong rent control, strong tenant protection, similar population density, they've been aggressively building new housing for over a decade, along with their neighbors in Oakland and Emeryville. And they're seeing new lease rents in their rent controlled units at rents that they haven't seen since 2018. And that's before accounting for inflation. And so I think that's absolutely part of the equation is that we have to take that displacement pressure off. Now, I acknowledge that, there's a balancing act that we have to strike here. Building not done right can cause displacement pressure on existing units. And I think in earlier versions of the bill, it needed to get stronger. I think it ended up in a pretty good place, although there's still gaps that remain, particularly around renters who are in single family homes or duplexes who aren't offered the same degree of protection. So I think going forward as a rent control board member and as an advocate, I think that's where we kind of need to hone in next.
Yeah, but you say that you supported it from the start when it had absolutely no protections for rent controlled tenants. How do you see that aligning with the mission of the rent control charter, which is to protect existing rent controlled tenants.
Yeah, I think the rent control charter is actually, yeah, I think the rent control charter is actually a great place to kind of ground that because the literal first sentence in the rent control charter, and this was from the original ballot language in April 1979, the first five words are a growing shortage of housing units. And then it goes on to say how that's creating low vacancy rates and rapidly rising rents that are pushing people out and causing displacement. So I think we have to consider the total housing supply and how that kind of intersects with pressure on existing tenants, right? And so I think that abundant housing is its own form of leverage for tenants that helps protect tenants. That is alone is not sufficient. That's why we have to look at protecting the existing housing stock and protecting incumbent renters. But I think we can't lose sight of that bigger picture and the greater forces that will kind of push on the rental market here in Santa Monica.
I respectfully disagree.
All right.
Hey Brad,
Okay, Don, go ahead.
I definitely appreciate your point about increasing housing and that effort to and the theory around decreasing affordability within the space of kind of say YIMBY space. I would say that there are some voices that are openly hostile to rent control and protections for renters in that respect. They see those policies as something that kind of affects the market. What would you say to people that make that argument that see kind of Santa Monica's renter protections as kind of an anachronism? Like, is there leadership that we could show where our rent control policies are something that should actually be a model for other communities, and that those voices within the YIMBY space should be pushed back against? That you could have what you would consider pro housing policies and rent control.
Yeah, so I think you've identified a real tension in the modern pro-housing sort of YIMBY movement. And I like to kind of show to kind of two contrasting examples from up north in California, right? Where you have the sort of San Francisco grow SF minded people who are very explicitly saying, oh, we're not that progressive, we're more moderate, we're trying to kind of have that more moderate tent and are much more skeptical of rent control. Then you go east across the bay and you see organizations like East Bay for Everyone that are going for a much more inclusive, progressive, well, no, building more housing and protecting incumbent renters are two great flavors that taste great together, right? And so I look up to leaders, well, he's no longer on the Berkeley City Council, but like Rigel Robinson. I look up to leaders like Alfred Twu on the rent control board up in Berkeley, who show that, we can hold both of those values aligned. And here in Santa Monica, fortunately, I've done a lot of organizing of younger professionals and young families and people who are very interested in building more housing in the city. And I would say, at least in my personal experience, I think most people fall into that latter camp of that kind of progressive yes and I've been quite aggressive when I encounter people who have that kind of more, I don't know, call it conservative, laissez-faire prescription because, while I strongly believe that abundant housing gives tenants leverage and protection, I think there's always going to be a place and a need to have rent control programs and rent stabilization because we never know what nature, what fate is going to throw at us. Like what happened with the Eaton and the Palisades fire, where overnight thousands of people were displaced, right? So even if we had tons of housing, like we need to make sure that the people in the surrounding communities are not kicked out of their homes when there's, some sort of disaster or something like that occurring. Does that answer your question, or is there anything else you want to
No,
know?
it does. I think that there is that thing, and it's just kind of I do think that it is an important feature of Santa Monica, and I guess one of the questions is like, can it be replicated in other communities? Like, is what we have something that should be expanded to other communities, or is it just kind of the sense that oh, Santa Monica, we're just going to keep it here, but no one else gets the benefits of this kind of policy structure that was implemented and that we get the benefits of?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I'm very open to Costa-Hawkins reform. I want to see, I think every renter in California should have some degree of like rent stabilization protection, right? And I think that we should be growing the rent control stock over time. Aisha Wahab in 2023 had a bill that would have allowed that. Unfortunately, did not make it all the way through the legislature. But there are great thinkers and there are legislators who are focused on that. And I want to be part of that fight.
Thank you.
Okay, Isabel.
Unmute. Hi, Brad.
Hi, Isabel.
So, um, you said one of your priorities would be to expand rent control to all renters. Um, So, first of all, can you briefly outline which renters are not covered? And also, what could you do as a Santa Monica Rent Board member to expand that?
Yeah. So, generally any renter who's in a building that was built after 1979 is not protected here in Santa Monica. And then, there's some nuance to it, but generally renters in a owner occupied duplex or renting a single family home are not afforded the same degree of protection. So I think we should have those same degree of protections across the board. And kind of as mentioned in my previous answer, I think Costa-Hawkins reform really is the big legislative hurdle that we need to get over or we need to start chipping away at to expand those degrees of protections. And I think there's other ways that we can kind of build that base and build other tools to kind of help us get there. So I know that our current council, for example, is looking at having a citywide rental registry. So we have a rental registry here in Santa Monica for just the rent controlled units. And that's a quite useful database of information that we can use. And I personally believe is underutilized. But kind of having that comprehensive citywide information, I will enable our council and also our rent board and other policy, leaders here in the city and on the west side to kind of have better information when crafting these kind of policies to help protect renters.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hi again.
Hello.
I do appreciate your civic engagement, both with city council and attending some of the rent board meetings. You say in your questionnaire that you have you have watched many of the rent control board meetings virtually over the past 2 years, and that you've spoken at public comment at city council several times. I'm not sure. Have you spoken at a rent control board meeting in the past?
Oh, no, I have not given comment at a rent control board meeting in the past.
Are there any meetings in particular that you've watched that you or anything that jumps out to you that you might want to comment about?
Yeah, so with the proposed like ballot measures that are coming up, I think I'm generally I'm in favor of the term limit expansion. As you know, Kay, there's been a tremendous amount of turnover on the board, especially over the last like 5-10 years. I think it's created a real issue with preserving institutional knowledge. And it's great when we have, board members like Anastasia Foster, Carolyn Torosis do their time and then move on to bigger and better things. But we do lose kind of their accumulated knowledge over time, right? And so, if you want to serve for like an additional 4 years, like I'd be very pro and supportive of that because I think we need that institutional knowledge to kind of help the agency run effectively, and also to kind of train new board members when they come in, right?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sean.
Um, we have quite a few actually candidates for rent control board, and I see in your questionnaire you said that you estimate to raise about 5,000. Is that what you expect, or do you expect more? I mean, I've seen you around the political community for quite a bit of time, so I was just wondering if maybe that's the number, or and why? Why is it that amount rather than a higher amount if it's going to be a competitive race?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Well, so, I feel things have been quite up in the air. I would say like a month ago, at least to me, from where I was sitting, and maybe y'all had no more than me, but it seemed like maybe it wouldn't be as quite competitive. I would say I'm blanking on the exact number, but you need about conservatively about $2,000, just to get on the ballot and set up all the infrastructure and get your candidate statement out and so on. And so that to me was setting the initial floor, and then I budgeted a little bit on top of that just for just call it additional campaign infrastructure, right? Like I still need to get up a website. I want to try to get my name out there, ideally with physical media or a mix of physical and digital media. I'm a first-time candidate. I'm figuring out some of this kind of on the fly. I do feel fortunate where having been involved in the city for a few years now, I have a lot of people who are willing to give me advice. And that initial number seemed good. If it seems like it's going to be quite competitive, and I feel good about the campaign, then yeah, I'm gonna shoot higher than that if that's what it takes.
I have a question about Measure GS. I saw that you put in your questionnaire that you don't want to see it changed, at least not right now, while we're waiting on some other outside factors to see how it does. So setting that aside and assuming that it brings in a lot of money in the very near future. What kinds of programs would you be most interested in seeing the city put that pool of money toward?
I think there's a few different areas I'd like us to see us apply that money. So the first, most obvious to me, are renters, especially those on fixed income, struggling with small rental debt. So if we can help close that gap and keep them in their home, I think that's paramount. A lot of these people, if they lose their home, there's nowhere else for them to go. Their community is here. They can't afford to remain in the community otherwise. In addition to that, something I've experienced just personally, I've lived in two different rent controlled buildings. What I really enjoy about the program is it's kind of preserved, especially generational diversity. I've experienced of that in both of the buildings that I've lived in. But I have seen the struggle of, these buildings that were built in the 60s, far before the ADA was law. And I've watched them struggle to age in their final years of their life, right? And so, like, if we can apply some of that funding where applicable to do ADA installation, or Rick Spur passed a bill a couple years ago to help facilitate mobility impaired renters to be able to move into a new unit at the same rent, right? So, like, if we can focus on those kind of programs, especially to help the seniors that are aging in place, but maybe can't get up and down the stairs anymore. I mean that's someone that kind of comes up to me personally, right? I had two neighbors who have now passed, but in my previous building, in the last couple of years of their lives, I was helping them push the wheelchair up the stairs, right? And it wasn't a fun experience for anyone, but again, they had nowhere else to go. But in that case, especially for Alan, who was on the ground floor, I do think his unit in particular, we probably could have worked something out to get a like ramp installed. Well, I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, so don't quote me on that. But from my naive vantage point, it seemed like someone like him we could have helped.
Okay, Isabel.
Hi, whoops, unmute. There we go. Hi again, Brett. So, as you know, recently we had quite a bit of controversy in Santa Monica over Rick Sabur's bill on AB 1740 on the coastal zoning. And when this came up for a vote here at our club, I was deluged with letters from various Santa Monicans and neighborhood groups all opposing this bill. And in particular, it's changed since then, but at that time it had a housing section of it. But you and someone else sent the only support letter that was from Santa Monica Forward. And you had articulated reasons why you were for the bill at that time. I'm wondering if you could explain why you were for the bill, what motivated you, uh, so strongly to even send a support letter.
Yeah, so I think I am a huge Santa Monica booster. Look, I want to raise my future kids here, raise family here, maybe hopefully die here. Not anytime soon, of course. But, I and it really hurts me to see the city struggle to recover, especially from COVID and everything that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, right? And so I I strongly support the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission and its purpose to provide access to the coast. From my perspective, I believe 1740 was, addressing a gap where we don't have a certified local coastal plan. I think that's a whole can of worms about why that isn't the case. But from where I was sitting, I think 1740, at least at that iteration of the bill, kind of to your point, it's changed a little bit,
Yeah.
was to fix some of those bureaucratic delays that were coming up because we didn't have a local coastal plan. And be able to kind of get permits moving and to be able to get pro-environment mobility options moving and so on. So that's kind of what drove my initial support of the bill. It's gone through several iterations. I personally am quite happy with where it's at now. I think kind
Mhm.
of getting the city back on track to getting a certified local coastal plan is very important, and I'm very glad to see that the pro-environment sort of mobility and parking changes are now going to be applicable statewide.
What about in particular the housing part of it that was later taken out?
Yeah, I mean, it was my understanding of the bill, right? It was not changing the underlying zoning or what could be built. It was just saying, like, for things that are already could be built under the zoning, it had to go through another round of coastal review. And in my view, that was duplicative. And I understand the argument, I totally understand that people are coming from a good place where we want to make sure that we're not degrading our coastal environment, right? And look, I also think that building infill housing is a very pro-environmental move. Look, there's nuance to it. Of course, it can be done poorly, but a home being built on an empty parking lot in the coastal zone versus homes being built out in the wildland urban interface in Santa Clarita, I think that home on the parking lot in the coastal zone is going to be far better for the environment than building into the hills in Santa Clarita. And so that's kind of what drives my thinking on that, a sort of think globally, act locally.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I think if it's with respect, Kay, I think we'll cut it off since we've got to ask a few questions each and we're a bit over time. So thank you so much, Brad. Appreciate you coming by.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. Thank you for your consideration. Happy last day of spring. Have a good weekend.
See you later.